Our first speaker is David Rich with the topic, What Role Does Anti-Semitism Play in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party?
Thank you. Okay, let's hope that works. Wow, it's a real honour to be first up, I have to say. I'll try and do it justice. You may have noticed, if you've been following debates in the United Kingdom, that anti-Semitism has become a national political issue in the country for the first time, certainly in my lifetime. This is a new experience for British Jews, who comprise about 300,000 people in a country of 66 million. And 2/3 of British Jews live either in London or in Manchester, which means most people in the UK don't know any Jews, or certainly don't know them very well, and either never think about Jews or feel generally favourable towards them, according to opinion polls, which show that the general British population is one of the least anti-Semitic publics on earth. Many British people, according to another poll, don't even know what the word anti-Semitism means. And yet that word has been on the front pages of British newspapers, it's led nightly news broadcasts, and it's been the subject of debates and arguments in Parliament over the last couple of years. And all of this is because of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Now this is pretty odd, because Labour was historically the party that British Jews voted for and that stood up for them against anti-Semitism. For much of the 20th century, the Conservatives were the party of the golf clubs and the law firms and the city banks that didn't want to allow Jews in through the door. And Labour saw Jews as their natural constituency, and vice versa. Now this began to change in the 1980s for various reasons, and Jewish voting patterns have not remained as loyal to Labour as they have to the Democrats in this country. But still, there was, until very recently, a genuine affection for the Labour Party amongst many British Jews, particularly under the leadership of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And this is no longer the case. And the reason it's no longer the case is because the Labour Party is no longer the Labour Party, even though it has the same name. Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him, unlike his predecessors, do not really come from a Labour tradition at all. He's a typical product of the radical 1960s New Left, the left that grew up in post-war prosperity, that cut its political teeth campaigning against nuclear weapons, apartheid and the Vietnam War, that benefited from the novelty of mass higher education, although Corbyn himself was not intellectually up to taking advantage of that particular privilege. It's the left that views Western colonialism as a historic crime of equal or greater magnitude than the Holocaust, and sees American-led imperialism as its modern expression, and that sees Israel as nothing other and nothing more than a settler state created through ethnic cleansing, the last great colonial wrong that still is waiting to be put right. Corbyn became a Member of Parliament in 1983, and he used his platform to promote all his favourite far-left causes. In the 1980s, he was best known for his support for the IRA at a time when they were conducting bombing campaigns, not just in Northern Ireland, but in the mainland UK as well. Famously, in 1984, he invited 2 convicted IRA terrorists to a meeting in Parliament 2 weeks after an IRA bomb had killed 5 people at the Conservative Party annual conference. And at the same time, Corbyn was also an avowed anti-Zionist. When he became an MP, he was already a sponsor of a small group called the Labour Movement Campaign for Palestine that pledged to, quote, eradicate Zionism from the Labour Party, campaigned for Labour to cut its ties with its Israeli sister party, and called for a single secular democratic state of Palestine to replace Israel. There were other pro-Palestinian campaign groups active in the Labour Party in the 1980s, but Corbyn, as he does on so many issues, chose the one with the most extreme rhetoric and the most radical programme. Now, if we fast forward from the 1980s to this century, the involvement of Tony Blair's Labour government in the 2003 Iraq war and the role of Corbyn in leading the campaign against that war is the foundational myth of Corbynism. It was the product, so this myth goes, of a right-wing Labour leadership enthralled to American power, dazzled by free market economics, and funded not by trade unions as it historically was, but by private donors, many of whom were Jewish. And the resentment and the sense of shame and betrayal that war and a Labour government's role in it fostered on the British left are essential to understanding how Corbyn became leader of the party. He was chair of the Stop the War Coalition, which was the main anti-war campaign group that was run by veterans of Britain's small communist and Trotskyist parties who allied with UK-based Islamists from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they attracted the temporary support of huge numbers of ordinary members of the public due to the unpopularity of the war. They held what was, possibly until yesterday's anti-Brexit march, the largest political demonstration ever held in the United Kingdom. The Stop the War Coalition was quite happy to work with supporters of Hamas and Hezbollah and other violent Islamist groups who they met in the Middle East and who they invited to the UK. And they endorsed statements supporting the right of Palestinians and Iraqis to resist occupation by military struggle, which at that time meant killing British troops in Iraq. And they rejected, of course, as they put it, the legitimacy of the racist Zionist entity. Now, in trying to understand the politics of Corbyn and his part of the left, central to it is the idea of the fundamental illegitimacy of Western power and the nexus of that power with capitalism and globalization. In their thinking, Western power is at the root of all the world's problems, and violent resistance against the West is always legitimate for that reason. Because the West hoards power and wealth and uses it to oppress and subjugate other nations, not just through military interventions, but through global financial institutions as well. And these sentiments are quite widespread on the British left. According to one poll in March last year, 68% of Labour Party members think the United States is a force for bad in the world, and just 16% think it's a force for good. And only 50% of them think the UK is a force for good in the world. Corbyn has previously called for NATO to be dismantled, believing it to be a vehicle for Western military expansion that provoked the Cold War and the war in Ukraine. He was extremely reluctant to condemn both Assad and Putin for their various crimes. If he becomes Prime Minister, the so-called special relationship between Britain and the United States will no longer apply. And that would be the case whoever was in the White House. Because when it comes to foreign policy, Corbyn's first question is always, what would America do? And then he does the opposite. Now, his rise to the leadership of the Labour Party is part of a wider populist surge that has affected lots of countries. As we've seen, the centre ground has dropped out of British politics. But rather than the tired, old, established parties being replaced by new insurgent parties, as has happened in some countries, they have instead been whittled out from the inside by a combination of smart organising and large-scale recruitment of new members. Corbyn's leadership campaign used the membership lists of the Stop the War Coalition, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and other far-left campaign groups to recruit people to the Labour Party simply to elect him as leader. Now, a lot of these new members were young idealists who know that they are likely to be less well off than their parents. They're going to have huge student debts, no chance of buying a house, and they were attracted by the promise of a different future. But a lot of these members were also former members from the far left who had left Labour in the past because Labour had moved more to the centre and have now returned. And these members are older, they are resentful, they are usually male, and they are responsible for a lot of the anti-Semitism and also a wider culture of bullying that has taken hold in the party. This generation got their view of Israel and Zionism from the vast reservoir of Soviet anti-Semitic anti-Zionism and all the same allegations of Zionist conspiracies, of fascist Israel, the purges of Jewish party members for alleged disloyalty, the idea that claims of anti-Semitism are usually false, and the core framework for understanding the Israel-Palestine conflict under Zionism equals racism. These are all common in today's Labour Party, just as they were in Soviet anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Now, for Corbyn himself, his own anti-Semitic record has got many examples, but there are three that have come to light in recent years that I want to highlight because I think they're quite illustrative. The first one is in 2009. Jeremy Corbyn invited representatives of Hamas and Hezbollah to speak at a meeting of the Stop the War Coalition in the British Parliament. And he explained that he did it because Hamas, in his view, and this is a quote, is an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region, and should not be considered a terrorist organisation. Now, it's important, he didn't just say Hamas have a right to resist Israeli occupation, or that they form the government in Gaza so they need to be heard. By claiming they're dedicated to social justice and political justice, he aligned himself and wider progressive politics directly with their values and their programme. The second example was in 2012, when an American graffiti artist painted a large anti-Semitic mural on a wall in an area of East London, which is known for street art. And the mural was a visual conspiracy theory that showed 6 old white men, obviously wealthy, playing Monopoly on a board that rested on the backs of darker-skinned, crouching, faceless people, the oppressed. And above them was an eye in a pyramid, which is a common sign used by conspiracy theorists. And behind them was a scene of industrial dystopia, with a protester stood at the side holding a placard saying the New World Order is the enemy of humanity. Now, firstly, this was an obvious conspiracy piece. But secondly, some of the men sat around the table, the bankers, the bad guys, looked like Jewish caricatures complete with big noses. And the artist confirmed that they were a mixture of what he called Jewish and white Anglos. But the artist claimed this was about class and privilege, not about Jews. Nonetheless, it caused a huge fuss. Politicians on all sides locally condemned it as anti-Semitic, and it was removed by the local council. And when the artist complained about this on his Facebook page, Corbyn posted a comment, sympathise with him. Now, when Corbyn was challenged on this, firstly, he said he was supporting him on the grounds of free speech, and then he said he hadn't noticed it was anti-Semitic. Now, I believe him when he says he didn't see any anti-Semitism in the mural, right? But there's only 2 explanations for why. The charitable one is that he missed it because in his understanding of racism, it is impossible for rich, powerful white men to suffer racism. It's the dark-skinned, downtrodden workers who are the victims. A less charitable view is that he didn't spot the anti-Semitic stereotypes and caricatures because he shares them himself. Now, my third example came the following year, 2013. Corbyn was giving a speech at a pro-Palestinian meeting, and a Palestinian speaker had been challenged by a couple of pro-Israel activists in the audience. And Corbyn came to his defense. And speaking off the cuff, he said, Zionists have 2 problems. One, this is again a direct quote. One is that they don't want to study history. And secondly, having lived in this country for a very long time, probably all their lives, don't understand English irony either. Now, I'll put to one side the insult to any Zionists in this room about not wanting to study history. The point is, the implication of his words is that English-born Zionists have failed to acquire the characteristics of indigenous English men and women. And this only makes sense if those English Zionists are descended from immigrant families. In other words, when he said Zionists, he meant Jews. Now, you put these 3 examples together, and you have the 3 main strands of his thinking. The anti-imperialist identification with violent anti-Semitic movements that want to eradicate the world's only Jewish state. And he identifies with them because they are perceived to be fighting against Western power. A conspiratorial association of Jews with capitalism and banking and exploitation, the old socialism of fools. And an older, very English type of anti-Semitism that will never fully accept Jews as part of the club. And underpinning all of this, his attitude, but also in the wider Labour Party, is the increased popularity of conspiracy theories. When Corbyn was first running for the Labour leadership in August 2015, one poll found that 28% of his supporters believe the world is controlled by a secretive elite, compared to 13% of the general population. And we see these conspiracy theories everywhere in the anti-Semitic discourse in the Labour Party. Whether it's the idea that ISIS is run by Mossad, because ISIS apparently stands for the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service, that jihadist terrorism in Europe and even school shootings here in the United States are Israeli false flags, that Zionist lobbyists have infiltrated Labour and are using Israeli money to manipulate it from the inside, that the Rothschilds are behind all the wars in the world. These have become quite common. And of course, the notion that any talk of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is part of a deliberate smear campaign by an alliance of Zionists, Conservatives and Blairites, Labour right-wingers, to prevent a socialist government from coming to power is itself a conspiracy theory. But then Labour's entire economic and political analysis under Corbyn is framed as a conspiracy, in which a global banking elite runs a rigged system, the quote they use, to the detriment of all good working people. I know the phrase rigged system is one that's used in American politics too nowadays. When Corbyn launched Labour's general election campaign in 2017, he said a cosy cartel has been allowed to rig the system in favour of a few powerful and wealthy individuals and corporations. And he's spoken of a failed economic system rigged for the wealthy and the corporate elite. Now, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he doesn't mean Jews when he talks about a faceless global elite that has rigged the system, but there's no doubt that anti-Semites think he is speaking their language. This kind of left populism, just like its right-wing cousins, sees the media as very much part of this rigged system. In his speech at Labour Party conference last year, Corbyn claimed that in Britain, a free press, this is his words, a free press has far too often meant the freedom to spread lies and half-truths and to smear the powerless, not take on the powerful. And then he spoke directly to his members and supporters in the audience. You challenge their propaganda of privilege by using the mass media of the 21st century, social media. Now, this has a few meanings. Firstly, that when the free press challenges Jeremy Corbyn, they're lying. And also, he shouldn't be challenged by them because he's not amongst the powerful. He's standing up for the oppressed. Secondly, he knows his supporters use social media to harass and abuse and threaten his opponents, including journalists. Now, he's not universally opposed to establishment or government-linked media. He's previously recommended Russia Today and Al Jazeera as more objective and better informed than the BBC. And he's presented programmes on Iran's press TV, for which he was paid around £20,000. But in his worldview, those channels are all part of the resistance to Western power, whereas the BBC is part of the rigged system that maintains that power. Now, to sum up, perhaps the best way to understand Corbyn's Labour Party, and therefore the role that anti-Semitism plays within it, is as a social movement rather than a formal party. Put simply, you don't need to be a member of the Labour Party to support Jeremy Corbyn. His whole movement, his whole project, is based on an ecosystem of Facebook groups, Twitter accounts, and alt-left blogs, where he gets a lot of his emotional and rhetorical support. And a lot of it comes from people who will tweet in his support. They'll use Labour Party hashtags and emojis, but they haven't actually joined the party. And of course, many of them have joined, but the point is you can be part of the movement without doing so. So anti-Semitism acts to bind these disparate parts of the movement together, and it gives them a common enemy to stand against. Now, this is expressed in a few ways. Firstly, by using Zionist as a political insult for any internal opponent, even if they're not Jewish or pro-Israeli in any way. Secondly, in this idea that there is a deliberate smear campaign of including Zionists using anti-Semitism to prevent him coming to power. And also through extravagant support for Palestine as a way of hitting back against allegations of anti-Semitism. Last September, after Labour had spent the whole summer under enormous pressure because they did not want to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism, in response to all that pressure, pro-Palestinian groups arranged for hundreds of delegates at their annual conference to wave Palestinian flags on conference floor, as if that was a direct response to these anti-Semitism stories. And if Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, one of the first acts of his government will be to recognise the state of Palestine. Now, this would be a purely symbolic move, but that's the whole point. The symbolism would be to Corbyn's supporters that they have won and that their Zionist right-wing opponents, the wealthy elite who control the rigged system, have lost. Now, as we speak, British Parliament is paralysed over Brexit, And it is quite possible, or even likely, that the government may fall and that there may be a general election at some point later this year. And Labour may well win it. Now, if that happens and if he becomes Prime Minister, everything changes. Everything for Britain, everything for Jews, everything for Britain's allies, and everything when we talk about anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. Thank you.